The wind screamed like a banshee as Zion plodded through the snowdrifts, his breath misting ghostly clouds that vanished into the cold air. The sky above him was a seemingly endless sea of blackness, only occasionally pierced by the weak light of a waning moon trying to cut through heavy, oppressive clouds. The village ahead was a jagged silhouette against the barren landscape, its spires of old reaching towards the heavens like bony fingers. Zion hesitated, holding the worn map in his gloved palms. It had brought him to this desolate location spoken of in hushed tones in the village. His flashlight danced wildly, casting macabre, elongated shadows on the earth. A strong gust blew it out completely, leaving him in blackness. He swore under his breath and rummaged for the lighter in his pocket when he heard it, a faint whisper, hardly audible above the storm. "Turn back," it hissed, sending a shiver down his spine. He whirled around, pounding heart, but there was no one there. Only the vacant stretch of snow behind him, going on forever. And yet the voice remained, its tone growing louder, more urgent. "Leave now, or you will never escape." Zion's thoughts were racing. Was it the wind messing with him, or something much more sinister? He shook his head, trying to shake off the sense of dread crawling up his neck. But deep inside, he knew this was not normal. Something was living in this icy desolation, something that watched, waited. Steeling himself for a nervous stride, he ignited the lighter, its tiny flame vibrating in the cold wind. The light illuminated nothing other than the desolate landscape and the hulking village before him. Nevertheless, the feeling of being observed continued to gnaw at his determination. "I didn't travel this far to turn back now," he grumbled to himself, but his tone was unconvincing. With fresh resolve, he pushed ahead, each thud of his boots on the snow sounding abnormally loud in the silence. As Zion approached the village, the heavy air became suffocating. The air itself was colder now, cutting through clothes and permeating his bones. Each breath was a struggle, as though the oxygen itself was fighting to get into his lungs. There were shadows flitting across the snow in the darkness, though there was no apparent source of light, moving and twisting as though alive. The village of Velcros was not just left behind, it was under a curse. Its cobblestone roads were covered in sheets of ice and frost, and its dilapidated structures stood at a lean, their windows broken and empty. With every step Zion took, his footsteps echoed abnormally, as if the earth itself shuddered at his touch. The stillness amidst the howling winds was palpable, with only the muffled creak of decaying wood, or the far-off sound of a bell that should not have been tolling breaking it. Over the entrance to the village was an archway adorned with intricate symbols. They glowed softly in the poor light, beating in time, as if a heartbeat. Zion paused, studying them intently. The runes were unknown, cut in a language older than time itself. Each symbol was a tale of despair, betrayal, and death, inscribed in patterns that seemed to change whenever he turned his eyes away. "This can't be real," he breathed, tracing one of the carvings with his gloved finger. The instant his skin came into contact with the stone, a searing pain coursed through his hand, and he pulled it back automatically. A single drop of blood formed where the symbol had scorched him, freezing solid in the icy air. A low rumble echoed underfoot, and he was taken aback. The earth shuddered, and the archway vibrated with a soft hum as if aware of his arrival. Zion moved back, his heart racing. Whatever energy resided here sensed he was there. Before Zion could make up his mind to retreat or push on, shouts came from behind him. Turning, he saw Imam Rayyan, Khalil, Kaiser, and Zubair walking toward him warily, their faces drawn and pale. They had crude weapons, knives, clubs, and one rifle, and wore looks of equal measures of fear and resolve. "What were you doing?" Imam Rayyan asked, his voice tight. "We've been tracking your footprints for hours." I became lost in the storm, Zion said, though the falsehood felt sour on his lips. He didn't wish to confess that the whispers had confused him, walking him in circles until he accidentally found the village. Khalil snorted in contempt. Lost? In this flat, open desert? Don't try to insult our intelligence. It doesn't matter, Kaiser interjected, his grip tightening on the rifle. We're here now. Let's just get this over with. Zubair, the quietest of the group, nodded silently, his eyes scanning the surroundings warily. Unlike the others, he hadn't spoken much since they set out, preferring to observe rather than engage. Something about this place unsettled him deeply, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Why are we here in the first place? Imam Rayyan interrupted, shattering the uncomfortable silence. Something here feels off. We have no other option, Zayd answered stoically, tightening the strap on his backpack. If these stories are true, then Velkros is where we need to be in order to stop whatever's been terrorizing our town. And if they are not? Khalil interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What if this is all some kind of old wives' tale that's just intended to frighten children? Before anyone could utter a word, a tremendous crash came from somewhere close. All 5 men stood still, their eyes wide with each other. Then there was the laughter, shrill, mad, and completely lacking in humanity. It rebounded off the walls of the buildings around them, so they couldn't determine where it was coming from. What in the world was that? Kaiser whispered, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. No one replied. Instead, they moved forward, attracted by both curiosity and fear. The deeper they went into the village, the more surreal the architecture. It twisted at odd angles, its roofs sagging down like molten metal. Windows distorted the image of the group, stretching out their features into horrid caricatures. Even the cobblestones beneath their feet rippled like water, yet stayed firm to the touch. They finally arrived at the village center, where there was a giant stone maze. Its frost-encrusted walls were tall, and grotesque faces, strange carvings covered its surface. There was a pedestal at its entrance, with an old leather-bound tome placed on it. This has to be it, Zion grumbled, extending a tentative hand toward the book. But as his fingers touched its cover, the earth beneath them lurched violently. The labyrinth started to change, its walls writhing like living tissue, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns. "What's going on?" Amal screamed, backing away. "It's alive!" Inaya gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "The labyrinth! It's alive!" Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman cloaked in tattered white robes, her face obscured by a veil. Her voice was low and melodic, yet filled with malice. "Welcome, travelers. You've entered the Frozen Labyrinth. Few who walk its halls ever return." Her words made a shiver run down everyone's spines. No one dared to stir as she moved closer, her steps eerily smooth on the uneven ground. When she came to a halt, she pointed at Zayn with an outstretched hand. "You bear the mark," she spat, her voice thick with venom. "You are the property of the Weaver." Before anyone could react, the labyrinth's walls surged inward, trapping them inside. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy with dread. From the depths of the maze came a guttural growl, followed by the sound of something or someone approaching, and then darkness. Through disjointed visions evoked by laying hands on the tome, Zion discovered the ghastly truth regarding Velkros. Centuries prior, the village had been a burgeoning civilization when a plague decimated its inhabitants, almost everyone. In desperation to survive, the villagers made a deal with an ancient being who went after by only one name: the Weaver. For their lives, the villagers provided sacrifices, innocents who were drawn into the labyrinth to be devoured. But the agreement had a price. The Weaver insisted on more and more, until the whole village was under its curse. Those who stayed behind were trapped in the labyrinth, their souls eternally bound to its cold passages. With time, the village disappeared from memory, reduced to a legend told among superstitious old men. And now, Zion understood. The weaver had stirred again. And it wanted him. Surrounded by the maze, the group clung to each other, their breathing misty in the icy air. The snarls deepened, with the crunch of claws on stone. Flickers danced upon walls, too swift to follow, encircling them as predators would circle prey. "We have to get out of here," Imam Rayyan yelled, his voice rising with fear. "No escape," the hooded woman answered softly, materializing between them out of nowhere. "Only the weaver determines who exits and who remains." And with that, she disappeared, leaving them to huddle together in the claustrophobic blackness. The growls escalated into roars, and the darkness solidified into ghoulish forms closing in all around them. Zion held the old book close, sensing its energy coursing through him. Whatever came next, he was certain of this. Survival would take more than braver. It would take sacrifice, and the weaver always took what was owed it. Darkness closed in from every direction, suffocating and complete. Zion held the ancient book tightly against his chest, its weathered leather binding cold to the touch, even though heat emanated from his shaking hands. The labyrinth's glacial walls towered above them like silent guards, their surfaces inscribed with shifting runes that glowed softly in the darkness. Every symbol beat rhythmically, as if alive, whispering horrors too awful to grasp. The growling had stopped, but the stillness was worse. A thick, suffocating emptiness that devoured sound. Each breath boomed abnormally loud, off the twisting corridors of the labyrinth. In the distance, a low hum started to swell, shuddering through the soles of their boots and into their bones. "We're being watched," Khalil whispered, his voice hovering above the hum. He clutched his knife in a white-knuckled grip. "I can feel it." "Of course we're being watched," Kaiser snapped, his rifle leveled on the shadows ahead. "We're stuck in a haunted maze with some sort of beast nipping at our heels. What did you expect?" Zubair remained silent, his eyes darting between the labyrinth's walls. Unlike the others, he hadn't spoken since they entered. His gaze lingered on the glowing runes, tracing their patterns as if trying to decipher their meaning. Something about them unsettled him deeply, though he couldn't explain why. Imam Rayyan approached Zion, the lantern throwing feeble, dancing shadows across the ground that was frosted white. "What do we do now? That book, does it say anything useful?" Zion paused, opening the book. Its pages were dry and yellowed, crowded with strange symbols and drawings of monstrous beasts. Some of the passages were written in Latin, while others employed a strange script that hurt his head to look at. One phrase was repeated over and over throughout the book: "Sacrificium pro libertate." "Sacrifice for freedom," Zion translated out loud, his voice empty. "Whatever this thing desires, it's not going to let us go without exacting a price." "Great," Khalil grumbled sarcastically. "Just what I wanted to hear." Before anyone could answer, the maze changed again. The walls creaked and groaned, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns. A thin corridor opened up before them, leading further into the maze. At its entrance was a pedestal that was the same as the one outside, except this time it had no book, only a single red gemstone set into its surface. "What is this?" Amal asked, shaking. She was pointing at the gemstone, which throbbed weakly, in tandem with the beats of the runes on the walls. "I have no idea," Zion conceded, advancing hesitantly toward it. When he got closer, the thrum became stronger, vibrating within his head. The gemstone glowed even more intensely, throwing an unsettling red glow onto the corridor. "Don't touch it," Imam Rayyan cautioned, grasping Zion's wrist. "It may be a trap." But Zion could not help himself. Over his own better judgment, he stretched out, his fingers tracing the gemstone's velvety surface. At once, a burning pain emanated from his hand, and he jerked back with a gasp. The gemstone blazed with white light, illuminating the entire corridor in scarlet. And then, the visions started. The world around them broke down into chaos. Walls of the maze disintegrated, and there were visions of unimaginable atrocities. Zion stood in the middle of Velcros many centuries ago as he watched villagers go mad. He stood beside men and women in a huddled circle, chanting as a screaming child was pulled to the entrance of the labyrinth by their hands. Gaunt faces stood out amidst emptiness, desperate eyes with untamed ferals. The child fought uselessness, sobs freezing upon its cheeks as it was thrust deeper into the maze by villagers. "No," Zion murmured, swaying his head in denial. "This can't be happening." But it was real. Far too real. He smelt the bitter odor of burning incense, heard the cries of the child ringing in his ears. The villagers did not stop there. Each one followed, one after another, young and old, innocent and guilty, all sacrificed to the weaver for survival. Then came the plague. Black veins spread across the villagers' skin, their bodies contorting into unnatural shapes as they screamed in agony. Those who survived became twisted reflections of their former selves, their humanity stripped away until nothing remained but hollow shells. Lastly, Zion beheld the weaver itself, a horrid thing made wholly of twisting darkness. Its shape changed perpetually, impossible to hold one's gaze upon for longer than a second. Eyes opened and shut all over its surface, each pair regarding him. It did not speak in words, but its voice was a chorus of whispers that intruded upon his mind. "You bear the mark," it told him, echoing the hooded woman's previous warning. "You are mine." With a shock, Zion came back to the world, falling to his knees. The others gathered around him, their faces white with worry. "What was it?" Imam Rayyan snapped. "Are you all right?" Zion shook his head, gasping for air. "It revealed to me everything. The history of this place, the sacrifices, the weaver, it's all real." "Great, just great," Khalil spat contemptuously. "Now what? Do we just sit here and wait for it to devour us?" "No," Zion answered sternly, standing up. "We press on. There must be an exit." The deeper they traveled into the maze, the more tensions escalated. The group constantly bickered, their fear turned into anger and frustration. "This is crazy," Amal cried, her voice breaking. "We shouldn't even be here. We didn't sign up for this." "And yet here we are," Kaiser snapped, glaring at her. "So unless you have a better plan, shut up and keep moving." Inaya, who had been remarkably silent until now, finally piped up. "Maybe we should go our separate ways. Cover more ground that way." "No way," Zion cut in quickly. "Separating is a death sentence. Whatever is inside here, it wants us separated. We're together." Mahnur agreed, holding her crucifix close. "He's right. If we're together, we have a better chance." In spite of their differences, the group moved on, traversing the ever-changing corridors of the labyrinth. There were more pedestals, and each contained something new. A silver dagger, a vial of dark liquid, a mirror with warped reflections. Each one of them appeared to throb with evil energy, calling out to them to seize it. "Leave them alone," Zayan cautioned every time someone would try to touch one. "They're traps, all of them." But curiosity was too much for others. When they reached a pedestal that contained a golden key, Safa couldn't help but pick it up. As soon as her fingers made contact with the key, the walls shook violently, and the labyrinth started to crumble around them. "Run!" Zayan yelled, grabbing her arm and dragging her forward. Huge chunks of ice rained from the sky and barely cleared them as they ran through the unstable corridors. A shockwave propagated through the labyrinth behind them when the pedestal burst, engulfing them with rubble. The others just managed to get clear of the way ahead before it crumbled totally and blocked off their escape route. "That was a close shave," Maiwa panted, resting on a wall for support. She went white, grabbing at her side as though she'd been hit. "Too close," Yasmin said sternly. "Next time, listen to Zayan. Don't touch anything." Safa bowed her head in shame, crying openly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's okay." Zayan broke in softly, putting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just don't do it again. We can't afford any more mistakes." The room they stood in was one unlike any that they had ever experienced. Mirrors lined the walls, with everyone showing twisted images of the group. They were shown as older in some and younger in others, but there was one in which Zayan caught a glimpse of something downright ghastly, a figure resembling him in the veiled woman's robes, eyes empty, soulless. "What the devil is this?" Khalil exclaimed, pounding his fist against the glass. The blow sent ripples across the surface, further distorting the image. "Be careful," Imam Rayyan warned. "We have no idea what these things can do." As if answering, the mirrors crumbled, spiderweb fissures radiating out until they lay in splinters. Out of the pieces, shadowy entities, human-like but impossibly long and stretched, stepped forward. They advanced silently, circling the circle like hunters creeping up on prey. "Hold together," Zayan commanded, holding up the ancient book in a defensive posture. To his surprise, the runes on its pages started to glow with a soft, golden light that drove back the shadows. "They're intimidated by it," Zubair noted, his tone filled with wonder. "Use it!" Stepping forward, Zayan recited the single word he could remember from the tome. "Sacrificium pro libertate." The words echoed through the room, making the shadows twist with rage. One after another, they dispersed into nothingness, leaving the group shaken but intact. "That was amazing," Manur breathed, looking at Zayan with wonder. "How did you do that?" "I don't know," he confessed, closing the tome. "But it worked." By another vision prompted by the tome, Zayan discovered more of the Weaver's past. Ages before Velcros, the being had been revered by ancient peoples as a god of destiny and fate. It spun threads of life into great patterns, weaving lives at its own will. As time passed, though, its power became evil, tainting those that sought its strength. The labyrinth itself was the physical embodiment of the domain of the Weaver, a prison for anyone who dared oppose its power. Each soul held inside the labyrinth strengthened it, serving its voracious appetite. Now, Zayan understood, the Weaver had selected him to be its next vessel, with the aim of using him to break free from its prison. As the group panted, the labyrinth changed again. There stood a great door at the other end of the chamber, etched with detailed patterns of the Weaver's various guises. It was surmounted by a plaque with one word: entrance. "This has to be it," Zayan said, his tone filled with foreboding. "The center of the labyrinth." "And what's outside of it?" Imam Ryan inquired nervously. "What's on the other side?" Zayan faltered, remembering the visions he'd witnessed. Only the Weaver knows. They hadn't even had time to make up their minds when the veiled woman returned, standing between them and the door. Her veil billowed gently, showing glimpses of her face, or lack thereof. Where her features should have been was an empty space, throbbing with darkness. "You've traveled far," she spoke, her voice sounding abnormally in the silence. "But the real test is yet to come. Will you confront the Weaver, or will you turn back and run?" Her words lingered, unsaid. At her back, the door groaned open, and a blinding light filled the room. From within it came a thunderous roar, causing the very foundations of the labyrinth to tremble. The decision was theirs to make. The blinding flash of light from the entrance flooded the chamber like molten fire, creating long, twisted shadows on the labyrinthine walls of ice. The accompanying roar was deafening, a raw, unearthly noise that shook the group's bones, causing their teeth to chatter and their ears to ring. It wasn't a sound. It was alive, probing their brains, pushing at their will. Zion froze, the old book clutched tightly against his chest. His heart boomed in his ears, stifling even the din from outside the door. He felt the presence of the veiled woman on him, her faceless nothing staring deeply into his very soul. Her presence had an aura of ill will so heavy it filled the air with a thick and heavy mist. "Well?" Khalil snapped, shattering the strained silence. "In or out?" "Because standing around here is equivalent to signing our own death warrants." "We have no choice," Zion answered, though his tone was weak. He looked at the others, hoping to find reassurance, or at least solidarity. But what he saw were faces creased with fear and doubt. Imam Rayyan held his lantern close to him as if it was a lifeline, and Kaiser held his rifle across the doorway, his knuckles white with too tight gripping. Safa hugged herself, silent tears running down her face, and Maiwa leaned against Yasmin heavily, who was just as pale and shaken as she was. "Sacrificium pro libertate," Zayan muttered to himself, quoting the phrase from the book, "Sacrifice for freedom." Those words had been a mantra, a grim reminder of what they may have to pay to get out of this hell. The veiled woman leaned forward, a look of amusement on her face at his uncertainty. "Time is short," she replied, her voice husky and musical, but tinged with threat. "The Weaver is impatient. Make your choice wisely." And with that ominous admonition, she moved aside, revealing the doorway to them. The light throbbed in a rhythmic pattern, drawing them forward like the call of a siren. With each beat, it seemed to whisper of salvation or damnation. Taking a deep breath, Zion moved towards the doorway. The others trailed behind him reluctantly, their steps uncertain but determined. As they stepped into the light, the world around them faded away once again. When the light dissipated, they stood in an immense, cavernous room, unlike anything they had ever experienced. The room of icy passages in the labyrinth was no longer present, but instead an infinite stretch of blackened threads floating in the air. They receded infinitely in all directions, crossing over each other in complex patterns that gleamed faintly with an otherworldly radiance. The threads hummed softly, singing a mournful melody that vibrated deep within their chests. "What is this place?" Amal breathed, trembling. She stretched out a tentative hand, and with her fingertips, touched one of the threads. A shock of electricity ran through her arm, making her jump and withdraw. "Don't touch them," Zion cautioned sternly. "These are not normal threads. These belong to the Weaver's sphere." As if to answer him, the threads moved, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns. Some curled up tightly, making serpent-like shapes that slid through the air like living creatures. Others unwound entirely, dispersing into strands of smoke that drifted off into nothing. The whole room seemed alive, vibrating with a wicked intelligence that observed their every action. In the center of the room drifted a giant loom, its spindles rotating continuously with no visible mechanism turning them. Threads were fed into it from all sides, weaving into a tapestry that portrayed scenes of misery and despair. Silent screams from within the weave wore faces that were frozen into eternal torment. Each thread stood for a life, twisted, broken, devoured. "This is where the Weaver works," Imam Ryan grunted, his voice sounding above the buzzing of the threads. "It's feeding on these people, drawing strength from their suffering. And now it's after us," Zion added darkly. He reopened the tome once more, his fingers rifling through its dry pages in hope of finding solutions. The runes grew brighter with each word he read, casting a light around the darkness. One section particularly caught his eye. "To meet the Weaver is to face the reality of one's own life. Only those who accept their destiny can hope to live." "What does that mean?" Manor asked anxiously, holding her crucifix closer. "Accept our destiny," Does it want us to die? I don't think so, Zion said reflectively. I think it wants something else, something more profound. Before they could push him any further, the loom gave a sharp clang, shocking them. The threads froze where they lay, and the tapestry halted its weaving. From the loom stepped forth a figure, a tall silhouette made entirely of twisting shadows. Its shape changed with every second, unfixable for longer than an instant. Eyes opened and shut all over its body, each one regarding them directly. The Weaver, Zayan gasped, his voice trembling with fear. The Weaver did not speak. Well, not in words. Instead, its presence erupted into their minds, filling them with images and feeling too intense to bear. Memories welled up uninvited, bringing up secrets they'd buried years ago. Regrets, fears, desires, all exposed for the entity to analyze, to savor. "No!" Zubair bellowed, covering his head as visions of his own past hammered into him. "Get out of my mind!" "It's inside us," Inaya gasped, sinking to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she relived moments of guilt and shame she'd tried desperately to forget. "It knows everything." Khalil swore loudly, pacing back and forth as he fought to maintain control. "This isn't real. None of it is real." But Zion understood better. The Weaver wasn't just reading their minds, it was untangling their very selves, disassembling the strands that formed them. If they couldn't hold out, they'd be destroyed, dissolved into nothing but another thread in the loom. "We have to resist it," Zion cried, lifting the tome. The runes burned with a fiery light, expelling a wave of golden illumination that repelled the shadows. "Concentrate on the present. Don't let it pull you back into the past." His words broke the trance of the others. One after another they recovered, encouraging one another. Imam Rayyan recited prayers, his voice calm even with the destruction raging around them. Kaiser took shots at the Weaver with his rifle, the bullets burning up harmlessly, but providing a distraction. Even Safa, trembling still from her previous error, came along, screaming defiantly at the creature. "You won't take us!" she cried, her voice cracking but fierce. "We're stronger than you." The Weaver recoiled slightly, its form flickering as if wounded. Encouraged, Zion chanted the phrase from the tome again. "Sacrificium pro libertate." The words resonated through the chamber, amplifying the tome's power. Golden light surged outward, engulfing the Weaver in a brilliant blaze. For an instant, it looked as though they would make it. But then the Weaver struck back, sending a wave of darkness that snuffed out the light. The threads closing in around them constricted, binding their arms and legs and dragging them towards the loom. "We can't keep it at bay forever!" Maiwa shrieked, fighting against the restraints. "What do we do?" "There must be a way!" Zayan yelled, searching the book wildly. His gaze met a last message, written out in large characters at the margin of the page. "To cut off the Weaver's hold, the thread of destiny must be sliced. But caution, for such deed is paid heavily." "Explain to me what it means," Imam Rayyan required. "What thread? Which destiny?" Zion hesitated, realization dawning on him. The answer was clear, though he dreaded admitting it aloud. "Mine," he said quietly. "It's me. I'm the sacrifice." The group erupted into protests, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of denial. "No way!" Khalil barked. "You're not doing this alone. There has to be another way," Amal pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We'll find something! Anything!" But Zion shook his head resolutely. "There isn't. The Weaver branded me from the beginning. That's why I heard the whispers, why I was called here. This is my burden to carry." While anyone could still argue, the threads that held them captive tightened agonizingly, choking off their objections. The Weaver loomed nearer, its dark skeins reaching out greedily. Time was almost up. Calling on all his strength, Zion went to the loom. He followed the shining threads until he came to the one attached to him. A thin, golden thread that throbbed very slightly with life. Holding the silver dagger they had seen before on one of the pedestals, he didn't hesitate for long before cutting through the thread. The impact was immediate. The loom exploded, flying apart in a shower of blackened metal shards. The weaver screamed a deafening shriek, its body imploding inward as if it were collapsing on itself. The threads dissolved into mist, and the chamber fell silent and eerie. But the win was costly. Zion fell to his knees, grasping his chest as blinding pain ripped through him. The hand mark, the same one that had scorched him when he first touched the gemstone, shone like fire, radiating across his flesh like wildfire. "What is happening to him?" Manur screamed, running to his side. "He's dying," Zubair spoke with a dry voice, devoid of emotion. Breaking the thread cut his link to life. Zion grinned weakly, blood oozing from the edge of his mouth. "It's okay," he croaked. "I knew what I was doing. Get out of here, while you still can." In disjointed visions provoked by the tome, Zion saw the reality of the sacrifice. Centuries before, the people of Velkros had tried the same ritual in an attempt to kill the Weaver for good. But they were unsuccessful because none of them was willing to sacrifice themselves. They sacrificed others in their place instead, continuing the cycle of hopelessness. And now, Zion knew why the Weaver had picked him out. He was not different because he was bold or powerful, but because he took his destiny without question. In cutting his own thread, he had completed the prophecy written in the book. Only those who accept their fate may hope to survive. Despite his body's failure, his spirit held firm. When the others pulled him towards the door, a sense of serenity washed over him. The Weaver was conquered, at least for the time being, but its presence remained, ready to ensnare the next rash adventurer who dared to tread the labyrinth. They fell out of the maze into the icy night air, panting for breath as Velkros village collapsed behind them. The archway buckled in a rain of ice and stone, trapping the evil maze forever. But as they moved to escape, Zion's body went slack in their arms. His eyes flickered open once more, locking onto theirs with a blend of grief and determination. "Take care of yourselves," he breathed, and his voice was almost gone. "And never forget, the Weaver always collects its due." With that, his form relaxed, his chest going still. The group stood frozen, their faces white with horror, their hearts aflood with grief and guilt. And then, from somewhere in the distance, a tiny whisper. "Turn back." The wind moaned pitifully over the bleak white stretch of snow as the group remained motionless in horrified silence, puffs of vapor rising from their mouths in the cold air. Zion's body was inert in Imam Rayyan's arms, his features pale and tranquil, as though he had merely dozed off. The sheer weight of what they had just seen, and of what they had lost, gripped them like an intangible pall. Khalil broke the silence first, his voice raw with anger and grief. "This can't be it. After everything we've been through, after everything he did, this is how it ends?" Nobody replied. They couldn't. Words sounded empty in the wake of such overwhelming loss. Each of them carried the burden differently. Safa cried quietly into her palms, and Maiwa hung on to Yasmin, her shaking body grasping for comfort in human touch. Kaiser walked back and forth, rifle over his shoulder, cursing under his breath. Even Zubair, the man who usually kept his feelings hidden, looked haunted, his eyes unfocused and distant. Imam Rayyan carefully laid Zion's body in the snow, sweeping loose flakes from his eyes and cheeks. "We should bury him properly," he murmured, his words choked with grief. "He at least deserves that." "But where?" Manur protested, pointing to the frozen wasteland all around them. "There's nothing but ice and death here." "We'll make do," Ryan replied firmly, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. He glanced at the others, searching for agreement, or at least compliance, but found only weary resignation. None of them wanted to linger in this cursed place any longer than necessary, yet none could deny Zion the dignity he deserved. As they dug a shallow trench with whatever means they had available, knives, sticks, even their naked hands, the whispers came back. Soft at the beginning, nearly imperceptible from the wind, they gained strength and intensity with every tick of the moment. "Get out now," the voices sneered, calling out in their ears. "Before it's too late." Khalil turned quickly, sweeping his gaze across the desolate distance. "Who's there?" he cried, his voice breaking with annoyance. "Reveal yourself." But no one was there. Only the vacant white stretch of snow and the heavy black pressure closing in around them from everywhere. The burial of Zion was painfully slow, exacerbated by the cold that pierced their very bones. Each scoop of snow was a betrayal, as if they were erasing the memory of their dead friend instead of paying him respect. But they continued, motivated by a collective sense of obligation, and maybe guilt. And when at last the task was done, they vandalized the grave with a crude cross made out of splintered branches. Imam Ryan said a prayer, his voice firm amidst the tears flowing down his face. The others bowed their heads in silence, every one of them lost in thought. But peace did not arrive. The moment the prayer was finished, the earth under them shook furiously, sending shockwaves running through the snow. The whispers became louder, intersecting and cacophonous, until they coalesced into a single blasting chorus. "You cannot escape." Up from the ground writhed tendrils of shadow, twisting and curling like living creatures. They wrapped themselves around the group, drawing them together until they were locked in a close circle. Fear flooded through the group as the shadows drew tighter, restricting blood flow and breathing. "What's going on?" Amal cried out, digging at the tendrils wrapped around her arms. "Stop it!" "It's not finished with us," Inaya panted, her breath catching. She stabbed a finger toward the east, where the remains of Velcros stood brooding in the distance. The village, which a moment before had looked deserted and dead, thrummed with an unnatural light now. Its windows flashed with otherworldly illumination, and the archway of its gateway glowed softly, inviting them back within. "No way," Khalil spat bitterly. "We're not going back in there, not after what happened." "We don't have a choice," Zayed's voice echoed, not from the group, but from somewhere within the labyrinth itself. The sound sent chills down their spines, freezing them in place. "How?" Safa whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "That's impossible." And yet it wasn't. From the shadows emerged a spectral figure, Zion, translucent and shimmering like moonlight on water. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made them look away. "I'm still here," he said, his voice resonating unnaturally. "But I'm not free. None of us are." The team gazed at Zayn's ghostly apparition, their minds torn between relief and incredulity. It was Manur who broke the silence, her voice shaking. "What? What are you?" "I'm a thread," Zion said enigmatically. "A piece of the Weaver's realm. When I cut my link to life, I became part of it." "That doesn't make any sense." Kaiser spat, his grip on his rifle tightening. "You're dead. You gave your life to kill the Weaver." "And I did it," Zion confessed, his eyes unflinching. "But killing the Weaver didn't remove its influence. Its power is embedded in the warp of this place, and in me. As long as the labyrinth exists, so does it." "So what do we do?" Imam Ryan asked, his tone laced with despair. "How do we repair this?" "You can't," Zion replied bluntly. "Not entirely, but you can further weaken it. There's another ritual, a means to seal the labyrinth forever. But it calls for something More. More sacrifices? Maiwa breathed, her voice a whisper. That's what you're telling me? Zion paused, his otherworldly form wavering slightly. Yes, and no. The sacrifice isn't death, it's release. Of fear, of regret, of attachment. Only then can the threads be undone. His words dangled there, unaddressed. The team looked around awkwardly at each other, everyone struggling to believe what he was proposing. This is crazy, Khalil shook his head and grunted. You're asking us just give up? Lose all that which defines us as us? It's the only choice, Zion pressed. If you grip too tightly, the Weaver will turn your own flaws on you. I promise I do understand. Before anyone could react, the shadows wrapped their hold tighter, pushing them to their knees. The whispers came back, louder and more threatening than ever. Sacrificium pro libertate. Having no other choice, the group reluctantly obeyed Zion's commands, making their way back to the labyrinth. The return trip was gruesome. The ground seemed to shift and rip apart before them, taking them in a circle until they found themselves back at the glowing archway again. Within, the maze had changed. The frozen walls were now see-through, offering glimpses of the outside world, twisted visions of their lives prior to arriving in Velcros. Some visions were reassuring, featuring fond memories and loved ones who had been left behind. Others were terrifying, illustrating their deepest fears and regrets. Every member of the group encountered their own challenge as they walked through the maze. For Safa, it was the remorse of having grabbed the golden key, causing the collapse that had almost killed them all. She replayed the incident repeatedly, having to live with the consequences of her own actions. For Imam Rayyan, it was doubt. Doubt of his religion, of his capability to lead, of his right to live. Shadows manifested themselves as accusatory figures, chiding him for his perceived shortcomings. Kaiser struggled with visions of blood and violence, tormented by the victims he'd killed as a soldier. Each ghostly victim called out for justice, their screams ringing through his mind ceaselessly. Even those who had concealed their secrets were revealed. Inaya uncovered her part in undermining the career of a friend due to jealousy, while Khalil admitted to stealing funds from his family to use on his gambling habit. Each confession ripped into their souls, leaving them open and exposed. Through it all, Zion's spectral form guided them, urging them to let go of their burdens. You're stronger than your past, he told them repeatedly. Don't let it define you. But the most difficult test came to Manur. Her vision took her to be standing alone in a dim room, surrounded by mirrors. The reflection in each showed her some different version of herself, some of her in triumph, others of her broken. One mirror broke, spilling a deluge of water that would engulf her. I can't breathe, she gagged, scratching at the suffocating liquid. Help me. You have to make a choice, Zion's voice rang out. Which one of yourself will you rescue? Manur hesitated, tears streaming down her face. At last, she reached out, taking the hand of the reflection that stood for her truest self, the one who had always yearned for kindness and compassion, even in the midst of adversity. The water receded, leaving her gasping for air, but alive. As the team moved further into the labyrinth, pieces of Velcro's past kept appearing. They learned from Zayn that the villagers had not been willing players in the Weaver's games all along. There were those who had fought back, trying to take down the entity and restore their freedom. One such uprising led to the development of the ancient tome, a weapon crafted from the collective knowledge and sacrifice of those who had dared to challenge the Weaver. The runes inscribed upon its pages contained the essence of their spirits, so that generations to come could harness their power. But the price had been high. The contributors to the tome's production were anonymized, degraded into silences that were tied to the maze. Their voices became part of the whispers in the halls, forever crying out to be set free. Now, the group had the opportunity to pay homage to their heritage. With the completion of the ritual, they could cut away any residual threads linking the Weaver to the human world, and no one else would have to endure what they had. Finally, they arrived at the center of the labyrinth, the room with the broken loom. Although the Weaver itself was missing, its essence remained in the shape of a glowing sphere of darkness floating in midair. Shadow threads emanated from it, holding it to the walls and floor. "This is it," Zion said gravely. "The last thread. Cut it, and the labyrinth will fall." "How?" Imam Ryan asked, his voice shaking. "We no longer have the tome." "You don't need it," Zion said. "The power is in you. Together, you can shatter the cycle." Each of the group members came forward one by one, placing their hands on the orb. As they touched it, they were reminded of their ordeals by visions flashing before them, memories of the agony they had suffered and the courage they had found. The orb drank in their energy, brightening with each second. But just as they thought they would triumph, a familiar figure appeared out of the darkness. The veiled woman. Her featureless nothing gazed right into them, her voice heavy with venom. "You think you can undo what has been done?" she snarled. "The Weaver may be beaten, but it is not dead, and neither am I." With a wave of her hand, the orb shattered, releasing a torrent of darkness that engulfed the chamber. The labyrinth began to collapse, its walls crumbling inward as the group scrambled to escape. "Run!" Zion shouted, his spectral form fading rapidly. "I'll hold her off!" "No!" Manur screamed, reaching out for him. "You can't stay!" "I have to," he replied, his voice filled with resolve. "It's my fate." As the rest of them ran, the woman in the veil looked at Zion, laughing as the collapsing maze swallowed everything. The final thing they noticed before the doorway closed was her lifting her hand, pointing at him straight. And then, silence. The maze fell in around them in a chaos of cracking ice and crumbling rock, the earth trembling beneath their feet. Debris and dust choked the air, cutting off sight and making each step a desperate risk. The party pushed forward blindly, their arms outstretched to prevent them from crashing into the crumbling walls. Each gasp was strained, the cold air heavy with fear and desperation. "Keep going!" Imam Ryan yelled, his voice almost lost in the cacophony of devastation. He tugged Safa's arm, dragging her along as she stumbled over a piece of crashed rubble. "We can't stop now." Behind them, the veiled woman's laughter reverberated through the melee, a note both sweet and evil, slicing through the noise like a knife. It was impossible to discern how near she was, but her presence hung heavy over them, choking them with an atmosphere of horror. Zubair, who had been leading the way, suddenly froze, his eyes wide with terror. "The exit! It's gone!" he exclaimed, pointing ahead at what had once been a clear path. Now, only a solid wall of ice blocked their escape, its surface etched with glowing runes that pulsed ominously. "No," Khalil muttered, slamming his fist against the barrier in frustration. "This can't be happening. We're so close." "We must do it another way," Kaiser snapped, whirling about to peer into the falling hallways. His rifle was carried on his back, of no use against the otherworldly forces moving to trap them. "There must be another passage." As any of them might have been about to answer, a loud snapping echoed through the room, and then the unmistakable sound of something or someone coming. Shadows took on monstrous form, their thin limbs stretched out in unnatural ways as they slid up walls and ceiling. Eyes opened and shut along their bodies, each one gazing straight into the group. "They're here," Amal whispered, her voice shaking. She held Manur's arm tightly, her knuckles pale with terror. "They're coming for us." The maze was alive in its dying spasms, twisting and writhing as if attempting to push them out of its center. Passages shifted erratically, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns that confined the group in smaller and smaller areas. The temperature dropped even lower, ice forming on their eyelashes and frosting their clothing in a thin sheen of ice. Above them, the ceiling creaked beneath the weight of falling buildings, pieces of splintered rock falling without notice. One fell just short of Yasmin, burying itself in the ground inches from her feet. She emitted a hoarse scream, backing away into Maiwa, who grasped her by shaking hands. "This place is trying to kill us!" Maiwa gasped, her voice cracking under the strain. "It's not just the veiled woman. We're running out of time!" As if in response, the shadows surged forward, their movements fluid and predatory. They encircled the group, cutting off any chance of retreat. Their forms flickered between humanoid and grotesque, their mouths opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Imam Ryan lifted his lantern, its faint flame spilling uneven light upon the beasts. "Stay in groups," he ordered, his voice firm, though fear possessed his heart. "No matter what, don't let them drive us apart." But even as he spoke, the shadows started to split, their tendrils separating and slithering towards specific members of the group. One coiled around Inaya's ankle, pulling her off balance. She shrieked, scrambling at the cold floor as it pulled her back. "Inaya!" Zubair shouted, rushing to her aid. He swung his knife wildly, severing the tendril with a single strike. The shadow recoiled, dissolving into smoke before reforming moments later. "It's no use!" Kaiser yelled, firing his rifle at the nearest creature. The bullets passed harmlessly through its form, doing nothing to slow its advance. "These things aren't real. They're part of the labyrinth." "Then we fight fire with fire," replied Manur, holding fast to her crucifix. She started reciting a prayer, her voice soaring above the uproar. To everyone's shock, the shadows faltered, retreating ever so slightly, as if repelled by her prayer. "Keep going!" Imam Ryan rallied, taking up the chant. The others joined in, their voices becoming one perfect harmony that echoed through the chamber. Golden light streamed from their collective belief, refusing to let the advancing darkness encroach. For an instant, they might have won through. The shadows slithered and danced, receding back toward the walls of the chamber. But then the laughter came again, faint at first, but growing louder and more derisive. "Your prayers will save you?" The hooded woman snarled, stepping into sight. Her frayed robes billowed theatrically in spite of the absence of wind, and her blank void glared straight at them, exuding raw malevolence. "You are merely threads in the weaver's tapestry. Your destinies were predetermined long before you came into this labyrinth." The group faltered, their resolve wavering under the weight of her words. Khalil stepped forward, brandishing his knife defiantly. "We're not giving up," he growled, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Not to you, not to this place, and certainly not to whatever sick game you're playing." The veiled woman shook her head in amusement, as if she found his boldness laughable. "Brave words," she remarked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But bravery won't save you. Sacrifice is the only thing that can reverse what has been done." "What do you want from us?" Safa cried, tears flowing down her face. "Haven't we given enough? Haven't we lost enough?" The woman's eyes stayed on her, her face inscrutable. "Loss is inevitable," she said icily. "It is the cost of being. But maybe there is still hope for redemption." With a flick of her hand, the shadows receded entirely, leaving the group to stand alone in the increasingly crumbling chamber. The runes on the walls pulsed brighter, beating in time as if counting down to something. "What did you do?" asked Imam Ryan warily, his lantern shuddering in his hand. "What manner of trickery is this?" "No trick," replied the woman, her voice a little less harsh. "A choice. You have until the labyrinth falls to choose, accept your fates and entomb the Weaver's realm for all time, or run and consign yourselves to endless torture." "And where is Zion?" Manur asked, her voice cracking. "What did you do to him?" The woman hesitated, her veil blowing very slightly. For the first time, she looked unsure. He chose his own way, she said quietly, and now you must choose. With that, she disappeared, leaving them alone again. The runes on the walls started to glow more intensely, their hum growing louder and more urgent. The labyrinth was dying, and with it, their hopes for survival. Through the countdown, the group argued about what they should do. Emotions were running high, tempers fraying, and accusations thrown about. There's no way we can seal this thing without killing ourselves, Khalil fumed, striding about. She's lying, she wants us to die. She's not lying, Zubair replied starkly. She's giving us an out, a painful one, yes, but still an out. And what if we don't take it? Kaiser asked, his rifle pointed at the shimmering runes. Do we really want to risk that? Before anyone could respond, the runes blazed brightly, illuminating the room with dazzling light. When the glare had passed, they stood in a dreamlike landscape, a huge stretch of darkened threads hanging in midair, interwoven in intricate patterns that glowed softly with a soft, otherworldly light. At the center of the room hovered the broken pieces of the loom, its spindles whirling wildly with no apparent mechanism propelling them. From out of the wreckage stepped Zion's ghostly figure, his transparent form dancing like a candle flame. You did it, he said, his tone laced with relief. I wasn't certain you would. How are you still here? Imam Rayyan demanded, his voice shaking. We thought... I'm bound to this here, Zayan told her, sweeping his hand around them. Until the ritual is over, I am stuck here. What ritual? Safa prompted, anxiety creeping into her voice. What must we do? Zayan paused, looking over at the group. All of you must sever your own thread, the filament linking you to this plane. Only then can the labyrinth fully collapse and the Weaver's power be eliminated. And what becomes of us? Maiwa breathed, her voice so soft it was hardly audible. If we sever our threads, you'll become a part of the tapestry, Zayan said softly. As I am, your memories, your being, they'll stay, woven into the web of life. But your bodies, they'll no longer be. Silence settled over the group, thick and oppressive. The weight of what he had said took a moment to sink in, each member struggling with the magnitude of the choice facing them. By piecemeal visions induced by the threads, the group caught a glimpse of the reality behind the ritual. Centuries earlier, the people of Velkros had tried something similar, trying to cut themselves off from the Weaver and regain their liberty. But it did not work, because none of them were willing to sacrifice everything. They instead sacrificed others in their place, continuing the cycle of hopelessness. Now, Zayan said, the group had the opportunity to end the cycle once and for all. By cutting their own strings, they could make sure that no one else would have to endure what they had. The act wouldn't only destroy the labyrinth, it would redefine the rules that governed its life, releasing countless souls trapped inside its walls. But why us? Inaya asked, her tone laced with resentment. Why does it always fall to us? Because you're different, Zayan said gently. You've overcome your fears, confronted your pasts, and lived. That makes you stronger than those who have come before you, stronger than the Weaver itself. His words struck home, sparking a flame of determination within them. Despite the daunting task that lay before them, they knew they had no other option. If they ran, the labyrinth and the Weaver would survive, continuing to feast on innocent lives. Individually, the group made its way to the loom, following the incandescent strands until they came upon the threads that were bound to them. Each thread was weakly charged with life, symbolizing their personal fates. Before cutting their ties, the hooded woman re-emerged, quietly standing at the perimeter of the room. You have made a good choice, she replied, her tone free of malice for the first time. But be aware, the Weaver's reach is great, and its power goes far beyond this location. Even after today, its resonances will remain. Her threat sent a shiver down their spines, but they continued, not wanting to be controlled by fear. Taking a deep breath, Imam Rayyan moved forward first, holding the silver dagger firmly. With a quick movement, he cut through his thread, his body disintegrating into golden light that blended with the tapestry. The others did the same, each action bolstered by a burst of energy that ran like a ripple through the room. When the last strand was ripped free, the labyrinth started to collapse as a whole, its walls cracking apart into shards of ice and darkness. The wall runes blazed with a fierce light, sending a shockwave that enveloped the party. And then, silence. When the light faded, they were outside the maze, the shattered remains of Velcros at their backs. The arch broke down in a shower of stone and ice, trapping the doomed labyrinth forever. But as they started to go, a dying whisper caught in their ears. The Weaver always collects its due. The wind shrieked despairingly over the barren white wasteland as the group stood in stunned silence, their breath misting the chilled air. Behind them, the maze, and the accursed village of Velcros, had fallen into ruins, its frosty spires shattering to dust as it too was engulfed by the featureless white horizon. Still, even in their seeming escape, an unbreathable feeling of dread clung to them, adhering to them like the ice bearings on skin. Khalil spoke first, his voice a raw edge of fatigue and incredulity. "Is it over?" he demanded, looking around the others. His hands shook a little, whether from cold or residual terror, it was impossible to know. Did we do it?" Nobody replied at once. Everyone in the group carried the burden of what they had just been through in their own way. Safa wrapped her arms closely around herself, shaking not with cold, but with remembrance of having cut her thread, a thing she wasn't yet certain she could fully understand. Maiwa leaned heavily against Yasmin, her face pale and drawn, while Kaiser paced back and forth, his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon for threats that no longer seemed tangible. Imam Rayyan knelt down in the snow, his head bowed in apparent prayer. Though he had been one of the first to snip his thread, the act burdened him. He breathed softly into his sleeve, the words lost on the harsh gusts of wind. Whether praying for forgiveness, direction, or closure, one could not know. "It's done," Manur finally replied, her voice hollow. She held her crucifix tightly, its metal surface warm against her palm despite the frigid air. "We've sealed the labyrinth. The Weaver can't hurt anyone else." "But at what cost?" Inaya whispered, her eyes on the ruins behind them. Her reflection in the remains of a frozen shard revealed a woman tormented by visions she could not erase. "We sacrificed everything, our lives, our futures. And Zion," Zubair contributed softly, his voice filled with melancholy. His normally reserved face faltered slightly as he mentioned the name of their lost comrade. He laid down his life first. We would not have gotten so far without him. The mention of Zayan ran a shiver of sorrow through the group. Though his ghostly presence had led them through the final test of the labyrinth, they hadn't laid eyes on him since severing their threads. Was he really lost to them now? Or had he been absorbed into something greater, incorporated into the fabric of existence as he'd sworn? Before anyone could entertain the idea any further, the distant whisper was back, calling out in an unearthly echo over the empty landscape. "The Weaver always collects its due." The words dangled in the air like a malediction, making their spines crawl. They glanced over at where the sound seemed to be coming from, but there was nothing, only the desolate sea of snow lying in every direction. The ruins of Velcros loomed ominously in the background, their jagged outlines silhouetted against the dim light of a waning moon. It was as if the village refused to let them go entirely, its presence lingering like a specter watching their every move. "What does that mean?" Amal asked nervously, her voice trembling. "Does it mean the Weaver isn't really gone?" "I don't know," Imam Rayyan admitted, standing up slowly from the ground. His lantern's flame danced feebly, sending out distorted, elongated shadows across the floor. But I think we have to keep going. Standing here feels wrong. As they started walking through the snow up to their knees, the stifling air became thicker. Each step was strained, as if the ground itself opposed their leaving. Shadows played on the snow in the absence of any perceivable light source, twisting and writhing like living creatures. Even the wind seemed to hold whispers, shreds of voices overlapping and cacophonous. "Do you hear that?" Safa whispered, stopping dead in her tracks. She cocked her head, leaning in to listen. "It sounds like singing." The others stood still, their ears catching the thin melody wafting through the air. It was eerily lovely, a chorus of ethereal voices singing in a language they didn't know. The song vibrated deep in their chests, calling up feelings they couldn't identify: longing, regret, acceptance. "It's coming from the ruins," Kaiser replied darkly, gesturing in the direction of Velcros. Though he had insisted before on going, he now faltered, his curiosity struggling against his fear. "We can't go back there," Khalil grumbled, shaking his head fiercely. "That place is cursed. Whatever's calling us, it's trying to catch us again." "But what if it's Zion?" Manur asked, her voice laced with desperation. "What if he's still waiting for us?" Her words rang true, sparking a beam of hope in the sea of despair. Was it possible? Had Zion managed to survive, or at least keep some kind of consciousness after cutting his thread? The possibility was both reassuring and terrifying, bringing a sense of redemption while also reminding them of the sacrifices they had made. Despite their better sense, they turned back towards the ruins, into the eerie melody, deeper into the destruction. Moving through the dilapidated structures of Velcros, tension was high. The group was always at each other's throats, fear taking the guise of anger and frustration. "This is crazy," Khalil spat, sending a hunk of ice flying from his path. "We're walking right into another trap. Haven't we learned anything?" "If it's Zion, we owe him to know," Imam Rayyan answered resolutely, though his voice shook with doubt. "He sacrificed everything for us. The least we can do is follow this through." "And what if it isn't him?" Kaiser demanded, his grip on his rifle tightening. "What if it's the veiled woman, or worse, the Weaver itself?" "Fine, we'll figure it out when we arrive," Zubair broke in, his voice uncommonly brusque. Quiet and reserved under ordinary circumstances, he was notably distressed, his gaze flicking about the shadows. "Arguing here is going to make any difference?" Safa nodded, though her face still looked distressed. "I don't care what it is," she confessed quietly. "I just need answers. I have to know why we went through all this, why we had to lose so much." Her admission struck a chord with the others, each of whom was struggling with their own unfinished business. For Mewa, it was guilt. Guilt at having lived when others had not. Guilt at the decisions she had made along the way. For Yasmin, it was regret. Regret at moments lost, chances missed, connections unexplored. Even Manur, who had always found solace in her faith, struggled to reconcile the events they'd endured with her beliefs. "Why would God allow such suffering?" she whispered, clutching her crucifix tightly. "What purpose could this possibly serve?" Before anyone could react, the melody came to a crescendo, beckoning them toward a huge archway in the middle of the ruins. Its surface was covered with glowing runes, pulsating in rhythm to the song. Behind it stretched a cavernous room filled with glimmering threads, suspended in midair like strands of spider silk. And standing in the midst of the threads was the veiled woman. Her presence sent a jolt of terror through the group, freezing them in place. She stood motionless, her tattered robes billowing dramatically despite the lack of wind. Her featureless void stared directly at them, radiating pure malice. "You've returned," she said, her voice melodic, yet laced with menace. "How predictable. What do you want from us?" Imam Ryan challenged, advancing defiantly. "We've already destroyed the labyrinth. What else could you possibly steal?" The woman cocked her head to one side, a look of amusement on her face at his bluster. "Destroy? Oh no, dear traveler. You don't understand. The labyrinth cannot be destroyed. It can only be contained. And even then, its power lasts." "What are you saying?" Kaiser snapped, bringing up his rifle. "Speak clearly, or so help me." She held up a hand, and he fell silent at once. The threads that surrounded her started to hum, vibrating with a jarring melody that made their heads throb. "You cut your ties to this world, yes. But the Weaver's realm reaches far beyond these walls. Its echoes will remain, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who are left behind." "Then what was the purpose of all this?" Safa screamed, her face wet with tears. "Why did we give our lives if it doesn't count?" "It counts," the woman said enigmatically. "Your efforts have slowed the Weaver's return, but delay is not defeat. Someday it will come back, and when it does, it will be angry." Her words chilled their spines, bringing a new wave of fear. They had thought their suffering was done, that their sacrifices had brought peace to generations to come. Now, they knew the truth. They had only purchased time, a temporary stay of execution before the cycle started again. "But there's hope yet," she went on, her voice a little less harsh. "For you, anyway. You're at a crossroads, travelers. Be careful what you choose, and maybe you can still redeem yourselves." She was gone then, leaving them by themselves again. The strands that enveloped them glowed increasingly brighter, thumping in rhythm as if a countdown was running. With disjointed glimpses inspired by the threads, the team caught a glimpse of the actual character of the Weaver's realm. Centuries previously, the creature had been worshipped as a god of fate and destiny by ancient peoples. It constructed strands of existence into complex designs, molding lives in accordance with its desires. Through time, its power became ill, poisoning individuals who searched for its power. The labyrinth itself was a tangible representation of the Weaver's cell, a place in between where dream and reality entwined. Those who crossed its threshold became ensnared, their essences tied to the threads until they were worn away entirely. Even after sealing the labyrinth, its power lingered, a contagion infecting the weave of existence. Now the group knew the extent of their mission. By cutting their strings, they had broken the Weaver's grip for a little while, but not forever. In order to fully destroy it, they would have to face its very nature head-on, and in doing so, risk everything. As the countdown intensified, the yarns changed color, moving in new patterns of configuration. A figure, Zion, walked out from among the threads within the tapestry, shimmering glassy, moonlight on the water translucent. His face remained serene, though his eyes crackled with fervor and commanded them to turn away. "You've reached quite far," he said, voice vibrating in unnatural cadence. "But one more trial stands in your path." "What trial?" Khalil snapped, frustrated voice cracking between his words. "Have we not done enough?" Zion paused, his eyes scanning the group. "The Weaver's presence is past the veil," he said, pointing at the shimmering archway. "To destroy it, you need to face it head-on, but be cautious, for such a deed is high in price." "And what price is that?" Manur asked warily, grasping her crucifix more firmly. "Will we live?" Zion did not respond. Instead, he moved closer, laying a spectral hand on her shoulder. "Some fates are worse than death," he whispered. "Choose wisely." And with that, he disappeared, leaving them alone again. The threads constricted around them, drawing them irresistibly toward the archway. As they stepped across the threshold, the world dissolved into chaos. They stood in a huge, cavernous chamber, unlike anything they'd ever experienced. The icy passages of the labyrinth were now nothing but a memory, replaced by infinite rows of charred threads floating in space. They stretched on forever in every direction, knotted into complex patterns that glowed with a soft, otherworldly light. At the center of the room floated the Weaver itself, a horror made entirely of writhing darkness. Its shape changed perpetually, impossible to hold in focus for longer than a second. Eyes opened and closed all over its surface, each one boring into them. "You have the temerity to challenge me," it whispered, its voice a chorus of whispers that clawed at their minds. "Very well. Let us test whether you are worthy." With a deafening roar, the Weaver surged forward, engulfing them in darkness. The Weaver's roar echoed off the cavernous expanse, shaking the very foundations of reality. Dark tendrils writhed and twisted about them, solidifying into abomination-like forms that blotted out the light around them. Every shadowy tendril flexed with evil power, reaching out to the group with ravenous hunger. The air thickened, became a choking weight, as if the thing itself was seeking to overwhelm them with its mass. Zubair fell back, his hands against his chest as if attempting to suck in air from a vacuum. This can't be," he panted, his words almost lost in the chaos. "We destroyed it. We closed the labyrinth." "No," Imam Ryan corrected curtly, his lantern wavering feebly in the heavy darkness. "We contained it, stalled it, but we never actually destroyed it." His words hung there like a death knell, falling into the others' hearts. They had anticipated this day may arrive, that their efforts would merely delay. But being confronted with it now was too much to bear. The Weaver wasn't simply alive, it was angry, its body twisting and spreading until it consumed the entire room. Its many eyes burned with malice, each one settling on them individually, searching for weaknesses in their minds. "You can't get away from me," the Weaver spat, its voice a cacophony of overlapping whispers that invaded their minds. Memories intruded unbidden, moments of guilt, regret, fear, all exposed for the creature to feed on. It grew stronger with each second, feeding on their pain. "We have to fight back," Kaiser shouted, raising his rifle despite knowing how futile it would be. He fired blindly into the swirling mass of shadows, the bullets dissolving harmlessly before they could make contact. "We can't just stand here and let it consume us." "But how?" Safa wept, sobbing tears down her face. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, shuddering violently. "It's everywhere. There's no way to stop it." Before anyone could react, the Weaver struck back, releasing a flood of darkness that doused the lantern's flame and left them in complete blindness. The temperature dropped even lower, frost crystallizing on their skin in seconds. Their gasping breaths were visible puffs of vapor that disappeared almost immediately in the freezing air. And then, amidst the pandemonium, Zion's ghostly figure once again materialized, standing sentinel between them and the Weaver. His ethereal form glowed dimly, throwing a golden shadow that kept at bay the closing darkness. "They're still away," he said calmly in the midst of the horror afflicting the group. "But it will cost everything you have left." The Weaver's realm was one they'd never seen before, a nightmarish dreamscape where nightmare and reality blurred together seamlessly. The darkened threads that encircled them hummed gently, singing a mournful song that vibrated deep in their chests. Every strand was a life, tangled, frayed, devoured. And together, they wove a tapestry of pain so immense it was beyond understanding. At the chamber's center swirled the remains of the broken loom, its spindles turning wildly with no apparent mechanism pushing them. Fragments of recollections, beyond their own, but all those who ever found themselves in the labyrinthine trap, flowed out from the wreckage. Faces cried soundlessly within the cloth, their faces contorted in perpetual torment. Others called out hopelessly, begging to be freed, while still others evaporated into puffs of smoke, leaving only sighs of hopelessness behind. The weaver itself towered over them, its shape ever-changing and impossible to fix on for longer than a second. Eyes opened and shut all over its body, each of them glaring right at them. Mouths yawned impossibly wide, showing rows of razor-sharp teeth that gnashed with hunger. Its tendrils crept around the floor, walls, and ceiling, constricting around the group and dragging them in. "This is it," Manor breathed, holding her crucifix in a tight fist. Her voice was shaking, but there was determination in her eyes now. "If we don't do something about it now, nobody else will." "Then tell us what to do," Khalil snarled. His knife held so tightly his knuckles were white. "How do we kill something that won't die?" Zion wavered, his otherworldly body shimmering momentarily. When he spoke, his tone had a gravity that froze the group into complete silence. "You don't kill it, you unravel it." "What does that mean?" Inaya inquired warily, her voice breaking under the tension. "Unravel it how?" "The weaver's strength lies in the threads it weaves," Zion said, pointing at the shining threads that enveloped them. "Every thread is a soul tied to its realm. To destroy it, you have to cut the last thread, the one that ties it to existence itself." "And where's this final thread?" Kaiser ordered, his gun pointed at the weaver even as he knew that it would serve no purpose. "Do we just start slicing at random and pray?" "No," said Zayn forcefully. "The final thread is connected to the weaver's existence. To get to it, you'll need to face your greatest fears, all over again." As if in answer to his words, the threads themselves started to move, reorganizing themselves into new patterns. Out of the tapestry came shadowy apparitions, twisted versions of the group, each embodying their deepest regrets and secrets. For Safa, it was a vision of guilt, a ghostly duplicate of herself clutching the golden key that had caused the collapse of the labyrinth. Her own reflection reviled her, mocking her for selfishness and foolishness. "You murdered them all," it spat, its voice resounding abnormally. "They all died through you." Safa recoiled, crying, "I didn't mean to. I was afraid. I didn't know what else to do." "You should have known," the reflection sneered viciously. "You always mess everything up." Nearby, Khalil faced a vision of his gambling addiction personified, a grotesque figure counting stacks of blood-stained money. "You stole from your family," it growled, its voice dripping with malice. "You betrayed the people who loved you most, and for what? A fleeting high?" "I've changed," Khalil shouted, swinging his knife wildly at the apparition. "I'm not that person anymore." "Are you certain?" the figure replied sarcastically. "Or are you once more merely lying to yourself?" Each of them, in turn, faced their own demons. Maiwa relived the experience of leaving her sister behind during a childhood accident, haunted by images of her drowning over and over again. Yasmin fought phantasms of the patients she had lost as a nurse, their ethereal bodies blaming her for ineptitude. Even Imam Ryan questioned his religion, racked by uncertainty about whether God existed or if he had wasted his life following a fantasy. Along the way, Zion led them, encouraging them to release their burdens. "These aren't real," he reminded them softly. "They're projections of your fears. Don't let them define you." But the toughest test was for Manor. Her eyes revealed her alone in a dimly lit room, surrounded by mirrors. In each reflection stood a different her, some of them victorious, others shattered. One of the mirrors broke, and a gush of water spilled out and began to overwhelm her. "Can't breathe," she struggled, grabbing at the water that was choking her. "Help me." "You have to make a choice," Zion's voice whispered. "Which self will you save?" Manor stalled, crying openly. At last, she reached out and grasped the hand of her truest self, the reflection that had always strived for kindness and mercy, even against opposition. The water pulled back, leaving her choking for air, but alive. With their own fears overcome and at least identified, The group pressed on, threading their way through the maze-like strands towards the Weaver's center. With every step, the creature became more and more enraged, striking out with strands of darkness that slashed through the air like whips. Every blow narrowly missed, and they were forced to heedlessly dodge and weave through the melee. When at last they arrived at the center of the room, they discovered the last thread, a delicate golden strand that beat with a faint pulse of life. This one was warm and different from all the others, a strong contrast to the cold hopelessness that had surrounded them. "This is it," Zion intoned. "Sever this thread, and the Weaver will be undone entirely." "But who does it?" Imam Rayyan trembled, asking his question. "Who gives the ultimate sacrifice?" Zion paused, his eyes scanning the group. "It must be someone who is willing to sacrifice everything, not only their life, but their very essence. Someone who is strong enough to withstand the Weaver's fury." No one had a chance to offer before the veiled woman returned, gliding silently between them and the thread. Her faceless void glared at them, exuding raw malice. "Do you imagine you can unmake that which has been made?" She spat, her tone venom-filled. "The Weaver is endless. Its energies endure beyond mortal means." "It needn't," Zayan argued, marching forward boldly. "No more." With that, he picked up the silver dagger they had spotted earlier on one of the pedestals and cut through the last thread with a quick stroke. The result was immediate. The Weaver emitted a deafening shriek, its body folding inward as if imploding. The threads disintegrated into mist, leaving the room strangely quiet. But victory was costly. Zion's ghostly form convulsed spasmodically, dissipating swiftly as the Weaver's existence lost coherence. The others stood in numb silence while he turned back to them once more. "It's done," he whispered, his words heavy with both regret and determination. "Take care of yourselves, and never forget." Then, in an instant, he was gone, leaving them to be left alone in the hollow space. With broken visions brought on by the threads, the group saw the reality of the ritual. Centuries before, the people of Velkros had tried to do the same, wanting to cut themselves loose from the Weaver and be free again. But they were unsuccessful because none of them were ready to make the final sacrifice. They sacrificed others in their place instead, continuing the cycle of hopelessness. And so, Zion's actions had remade the rules that determined the labyrinth's reality. Having cut the last strand, he had made certain no one else would endure what they had endured. The action didn't simply kill the Weaver. It eliminated its hold altogether, freeing untold souls trapped in its grasp. But it had come at a great price. The contributors to the tome were erased from their identities, left as echoes tied to the maze. They added their voices to the whispers wandering the halls, eternally begging to be set free. And now, the group knew, they had fulfilled their heritage. Having finished the ritual, they had cut the last remaining strands of connection between the Weaver and the world of mortals, so that no one else would have to endure what they had endured. As the Weaver was unspun, the room started to collapse, walls shattering in jagged chunks of ice and dark. The wall runes blazed brightly, spilling off a shockwave that engulfed the party. They moved frantically, desperately to flee, their feet scrambling on what suddenly became an empty space. Khalil stumbled over a piece of dropped rubble, landing hard on the frozen ground. Before anyone could grab him, a piece of darkness snaked around his ankle and pulled him back. He shrieked, frantically grasping at the ground as it pulled him towards the void. "Khalil!" Kaiser shouted, rushing to his aid. He swung his rifle like a club, severing the tendril with a single strike. The shadow recoiled, dissolving into smoke before reforming moments later. "Keep moving," Imam Rayyan urged, pulling Safa along as she stumbled over debris. "We're almost there." The way out, a constricting archway flooded with blinding light, loomed in front, invitingly close yet unattainably distant. The party pressed forward, battered and bruised but compelled by sheer will. As they made it past the entrance, the labyrinth gave way completely, its walls tumbling inward in a deafening crash. They staggered out onto the snowy wasteland, gasping for air as the ruins of Velcros fell apart behind them. The archway fell in a cascade of ice and stone, closing the accursed maze for good. But as they started to turn away, a distant whisper reached their ears. "The Weaver always collects its due." The words caused a shiver down their backs, triggering a new surge of fear. Despite the labyrinth being no more, its power persisted, a reminder that certain terrors could never really be eliminated. After what they had been through, the group remained in silent shock, reeling from the magnitude of what they had experienced. They had made it out, yes, but at a terrible cost. Zion was lost, his death guaranteeing their release. The Weaver had been destroyed, or so they prayed, but its aftershocks lingered, living off the pain and misery of those left behind. Trudging through the waist-high snow towards an unknown fate, they could not help but feel that they had only postponed the inevitable. One day, somewhere, the Weaver would come again, and when it did, it would avenge itself. Did you make it through the atrocities of the Frozen Labyrinth? Let us know in the comments below. Like this story to reveal special bonus content such as deleted scenes and character histories. Subscribe for news on future horror tales and other tales of terror.